thank you everyone for coming out and sharing part of the magnificent afternoon. We have a lot of competition, so thank you very much. I'm Steve Paling, and welcome to From the River of Stories. Storytelling is an ancient art, and it is like a great river with many, many tributaries. And today, three of us will be telling stories from select tributaries to that river. So we really appreciate you coming out. I'd like to introduce my fellow tellers. Julia Ellis Marvin began her lifelong engagement with storytelling in Boston, where she produced storytelling for public radio recordings, live stage, conferences and festivals, and she began telling her own stories a few years later. She's got a PhD in folklore and folklore, which I envy, frankly, and has taught in colleges and universities. From 2008 until 2021, she shifted to working for suicide prevention and crisis service here in Ithaca, New York, where she was challenged to use storytelling as an educational tool. Her storytelling programs have ranged from stories about wolves and adaptation of The Secret Garden, folk tales, and original stories. Julia Ellis is a longtime performer, but she's relatively new to storytelling. She loves reworking traditional forms and tales to create original work. She is passionate about the value of creative expression for everyone, and by day she works as an expressive arts therapist. In my own case, my home base in the arts for many years was poetry, and in the last several years I branched out into storytelling. I tell a blend of original and adapted tales, mainly from the folk and fairy tales tradition with a little bit of nonfiction thrown in, and I was recently the featured teller at Story Space in Boston. My poetry has appeared in literary magazines around the country, and I recently had a book of poems, Rooms in Old Houses, published by Cayuga Lake Books. So before I turn it over to Leellen, I thought it would be nice if we all took one long, deep breath and found whatever place it is that stories come from for you. So just right. Thank you. And Leellen.
Hi, everybody. One of my mentors is Brother Blue, and we've been reminded of his breath. Thank you, Steve. So I'm working on a program of stories about trees, and I've found my way to Ovid, the Roman poet who wrote a book called Metamorphosis. There's a ton of stories in there, often about the misdeeds and the good deeds of the gods, but there are two short stories about trees. I'll tell you two. The first one is a little bit dark. The second one is a little bittersweet. There once was a prince who grew up in a small kingdom focused on protecting its boundaries. The prince was raised by a stern father to be a soldier, to obey commands, to give commands. But when this prince grew a little bit older, he was invited to the feasts and the banquets of the neighboring kingdoms. And oh, he loved them. He loved the layout of all of the fabulous food. He loved the music, the entertainment, the dancing, and the lingering until dawn to pick at the last bits of food on the emptying platters. He wanted to host the banquet. He thought it would be good for his kingdom to connect in this way, and his father grudgingly gave him permission to build a banquet a little far off from their own castle, and nothing by stone. It's a waste of your time. The young man gathered some woodcutters, and they went into the forest. And there in the forest, they looked at trees, but this one was crooked, this one was tilted, this one had too many side branches. And then the prince saw, off in the distance, a certain green glow. "What is that?" he said. "Oh, sir, that's our forest temple. That's our grove of sacred trees dedicated to the goddess. And some say the goddess dwells there. I've got to see this place." And without a second thought, the prince walked into the forest, and he walked into the grove, which was magnificent. It was quite a temple. Every tree trunk was strong and straight with smooth bark. Up above, the branches wove together like dancers with their arms around each other's waist. And one shaft of golden sunlight fell in the middle of that circle on the smooth grass. Oh, this is magnificent. This is just the feeling I want my banquet to have. Let's cut these trees for the banquet hall. But sir, no, it's forbidden. You must not harm these trees. No, sir. This is where we bring our babies, our newlyweds, our old people. Nonsense, he said. Even though the woodcutters were backing away, the prince reached forward and grabbed an axe and swung at the nearest tree. He had no skill, so he merely made a nick in that tree. But high above, everyone could hear a gasp and a cry of pain. And the little tiny nick that the prince had made began to bleed. And yet the prince, ignoring the beseeching of his woodcutters, went around and made his mark on every single tree. And then he went around again and, getting a little more skill with his axe, tried to make serious cuts. The forest was filled with the cries of the trees. There was blood pouring from every wound. The woodcutters were on their knees begging him to stop, and the prince could only think of his banquet hall. He did not listen. And therefore, because he was so busy with his cutting, he didn't see when that shaft of light was suddenly filled with a goddess. She shone brighter than the sun itself, and she pointed one finger at the prince. May you never be satisfied. Now, at this point, the sounds of the cries were so loud that the woodcutters, they picked up their axes and they cut down the trees just to end the misery that was there. They wrapped heavy chains around those trunks and they dragged them out. Soon enough, a banquet hall was built with a large table for every kind of food. The night before the feast, the prince went to bed dreaming about parties and entertainment and long conversations. And as he slept, a whiff of something came into the window. Was it fog? Was it mist? Was it smoke? It turned into a bony woman, and she was famine, hunger. She had been sent by the goddess of the trees, and she was there to fulfill the goddess's curse. She climbed on top of the prince and she breathed into his mouth a cold, wintry breath. Then she was gone. The prince woke up. He was starving. He'd never felt such hunger. It was such a deep ache in his belly. He ran out of his bedroom and into the castle kitchen, and there on the table were all the feast food for the next day. Everything from fruits to roasts to nuts to cheese and breads. And he started at one end of the table and ate his way across the entire table until he had gotten to the end, just as the cook was coming in, who was shocked. All of that work for a feast, gone. Feed me, he said, feed me, I'm so hungry. And the cook got out more food and began to cook breakfast for everyone in the household, but the prince ate everything. He went into the storeroom himself and he just ate what he could find. And then he went out into the town and he knocked on the doors and he, like a beggar, asked for food. He was the prince. People brought out what they had. And then the town had nothing. The last anyone saw of this prince, he was at a crossroads, begging from anyone who came by, and then eating the dirt, and finally he ate on his own flesh. Now, I'm telling these stories because I'd like to do a whole program of stories about trees, some modern and some ancient. But I at one point, I have a confession to make, which is at one point, in my childhood, I killed a tree. There was a playground with a little spindly tree, and it had a bark that was particularly fun to peel. And one day, when there was no one else to play with, he peeled at that bark all the way around the whole tree. And I didn't think anything of it, but 4 or 5 days later, I stood on the balcony of our apartment, and I could see that even though it was July, the tree's leaves had turned yellow. And soon after that, the tree was dead. So I tell the story in part as an apology. Philemon was an old man. He stepped outside on the little porch of the house that he shared with his wife, Baucis, and he stood looking out onto the valley and the village below. Now, it had been raining for days, for weeks, and finally more than a month. The tiny streams that were on the hills above the houses, they were becoming rather strong creeks. Some of them starting to reshape the land as they poured down, and still it was raining. The hillsides were bare because people had cut all the trees to build their houses, and they were cutting even more because with all this rain and wet, people were burning bright fires. He could see fires glowing in every house. Off in the distance, he saw 2 travelers, an old man with a glorious white beard and a young man, very sprightly with curly hair. They were coming down the road, and they went from one house to another asking for hospitality. But even though it's the custom to welcome travelers, no one in the village did. These travelers were turned away. So Philemon turned back into the house, and he turned to his old wife. He said, Baucis, we will have travelers, visitors soon, I'm sure. Let's prepare. They got a bench, and they laid it out with something soft to sit on. They got a table. It was a little rocky. They put one little bit of wood under it to steady it. And then they got from their storeroom all the fruits and the nuts and the olives, both dried and fresh, out of the orchard that they managed behind their house. And soon they had a fine feast laid out. A little bit of dried fish and cheese in addition to what came from their trees. Soon there was a knock at the door. Now that was a bit of a surprise. They expected their goose to honk when the travelers approached, but for some reason it was quiet. There was a knock at the door, and the old couple greeted the travelers. Come in, you must be so cold and wet. Sit by the fire. And though they were always cautious about how much wood they burned, they put another log in the fire, sat their company down, presented them with all the food to eat. And Baucis took the cloaks and hung them up. Ah, these were very fine cloaks. Out from the storeroom came Philemon with a fat flask of wine, and he filled 2 cups for his travelers. And he watched, there's a certain satisfaction, when you prepare food and people start to eat it and really enjoy it. And he was really happy to see people lighting into his food and enjoying the wine. Soon he was there again to refill the glasses. And that's when he noticed that the flask was as full as when he had brought it out of the storeroom. He pulled his wife aside, and they huddled in the storeroom going, these are not ordinary visitors. No, said the wife, you must have seen their cloaks, the finest thread, as fine as spiders, and the embroidery around the collars and the hems. My gosh, those figures almost seemed alive. I am embarrassed, said Philemon, that we are only providing them with simple foods. I think we should roast our goose. With reluctance, his wife agreed. He took up an axe and he went outside and he approached the goose, who took one look at him and honked in dismay and ran away. The old man followed after her, and she ran as fast as she could around the hut a couple of times until she saw, the goose did, that the door was open. She ran inside, jumped into the old man's lap, and lay her head across his shoulder. And it was as if the old man and the goose were having a conversation. Oh, he said to the old couple, this is your pet, your guard dog. You must not kill her. She loves you very much. And that's when the old couple fell to their knees and said, forgive us. You are not ordinary travelers. Who are you? The old man said, well, it's true. I'm Zeus. And this is my sidekick, Mercury. Mercury. His eyes twinkled. And they said, you know, we travel all the time in disguise to see how people are doing, how they're living, and whether they are generous. And I regret to admit that you were the only people in this village who gave us anything. Now, said Zeus, he stood up. Let's go look and see what's happening. And all four went out onto the little balcony, little front porch, and looked at the village down below. Those creeks that had turned into streams were now looking more like rivers. They were picking up big boulders and rolling them down. Whole pieces of dirt were coming down, and the valley was filling up with water. The houses were being lifted off their foundations. There were people drowning in all of that. Oh, please, please, said the old couple, are you doing this? No, Zeus said, they have done it to themselves, for they cut those trees. Please, can you save them? And Zeus, with his hand, ceased the rain and the water quickly drained away. Then Zeus and Mercury turned to the old couple and said, you have been very kind, and you are generous, and you care about your neighbors. What reward would you have? The old couples looked at each other. They said, we are content with our life. We have all that we need, but we worry about the day when one of us would die and the other would be left alone. That shall be taken care of, said the god. And the two gods put on their magnificent cloaks and they went out into the darkness and were never seen again in that village. Now, because the couple helped the people who survived that terrible flood, it became the habit of people to come and see Baucis and Philemon regularly to make sure they had all that they needed. And it happened one day that the wife was sitting on that little porch cracking nuts when she heard a cry and a moan. She dropped what she was doing. She went around the side, and there was her husband lying on the ground under a tree he had been pruning. Oh my dear, and she came and helped him get up. Well, it seems that nothing is broken. No, he said, but I think this is my end, my heart. Oh, my love, no, do not go yet. No. And then they both looked down at their feet. What is happening? And both of their feet were spreading out like tree roots, and their toes were stretching out and digging into the dirt and gathering nourishment and strength. Their legs were covering in bark, and as they held on to each other, they could feel the bark traveling up, and they knew as their arms became great branches, their fingers became twigs, and they were even growing leaves, that their time had come, and Zeus had given his promise. And so they had a last few moments to say words of love, to remember favorite moments, and finally the bark traveled up, covering their faces with just their eyes until at last, even they could not say that they loved each other with their eyes. The very next day, someone from the village came up to see how the old couple was doing, and nobody was at home. They went around to the side of the house and they found two new trees, never before seen. One was an oak and one was a linden, and their branches wrapped around each other like old lovers. Great pleasure to welcome Julia Ellis to tell you an original story.
Thank you, Hi everyone, it's great to see all of you. As Lee Ellen said, this is an original story. It's called The First Gaze. Once upon a time, there was a woman who longed for a child. She and her husband tried for many years, but alas, no baby. They concluded that she was barren. She had heard of a witch who lived deep in the woods, who could grant any wish, but the price was high and the risk was very great. She was told that if she were to visit this witch, she needed to take her most valuable possessions and sell them at the market, trade them in for gold, and then venture deep into the woods to find the witch's cottage. And so she did. She took the ruby red ring that her grandmother had passed on to her and the exquisite blue shawl that her husband had given her as a wedding present, and she sold them at the market and came home with a small sack of gold. She was ready. She wrapped herself in a warm woolen cloak and slipped on her sturdiest leather boots, and she hugged her husband for a long time. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he said. "It just seems so dangerous." "I am sure. I have to do this for our family. I have to do this for our baby." She kissed him on the cheek, and she set off into the woods behind their home. She was told that if she were to find the witch, she needed to go deep, deep into the woods until she was in a place that she did not recognize. So she started out along the familiar paths, the trees, the streams that she knew, until the woods got darker and darker, and things felt a little more strange, a little more damp. And then suddenly there she was, in a place she had never been before. It was here, she was told, that she must close her eyes, connect with her deepest longing, and that would guide her to the witch. And so she did. She closed her eyes and she felt how much she longed to ache. She longed and ached to hold her very own child in her arms. And as she did that, she began to hear a bell ringing. She opened her eyes and she followed the sound. It took her down a muddy path overgrown with trees, but as she walked, it got louder and louder, and she knew she was going the right way, until finally, whoosh, she stepped into a clearing, and the sound stopped. She knew she was there, for right in the center of the clearing was the witch's cottage. She walked up to the door and raised her hand to knock, but before she could, whoosh, the door opened. Standing before her was a beautiful old woman. Her silver hair was tied neatly back in a bun, and she had soft, wrinkled skin and a slight smile. She wore a plain gray dress covered in an apron with colorful wildflowers. "You! Come in, come in. I've been expecting you." And the woman walked into the witch's cottage. It was cozy and warm. There was a fire in the fireplace. "Sit down and warm yourself. You will have quite a journey ahead." "So you can grant my wish?" "Maybe. Where's the gold?" The woman handed it over. Family jewelry and a wedding gift. Very nice. She tucked it in her pocket. "Maybe you can fulfill your wish if you listen closely. Here is what you must do. First, you will leave my house and you will see that the ground is aflame. You must walk across the flaming ground, and then you will find yourself at a thicket of thorny brambles. Walk through the thicket, listening for the sound of a rushing river. When you emerge at the river, you will see your house. But my house is not by a river." "Never mind. Listen to me." "You will cross the river, and when you do, you will go directly to your home. In your home, go to the first mirror that you see and look deeply into the mirror, for it is your own reflection who will grant you your wish. From your reflection, you will receive one perfect egg. You will know that it is working because your body will feel warm and a golden glow will emanate as that egg settles into your womb. On this night, lay with your husband and you will conceive a child." "Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll do everything you say." "Oh, and there's one more thing. If you come across anyone on this journey, do not look at them. Do not make eye contact with them. For it is the first gaze you see that will grant your wish." I understand. I'm ready. Let's go. They went to the back door of the witch's house, and indeed, once she opened the door, the woman could see the ground was on fire. It was blue and green and gold where there should have been green grass. The woman began to walk out of the back door when she felt the witch's hand on her shoulder. Oh, one more thing. Your boots. The woman looked down at her sturdy leather boots. She looked at the flaming ground and back at her boots. And then she slipped them off and walked barefoot out the back door. In a few moments, she was standing in front of the fiery ground. It was so hot. There must be another way, she thought. I think maybe I can talk to the witch about this. But she looked back, and the witch was gone. Not only that, the cottage was gone. She could only see the woods as far as her eye could see. She turned back to the fiery ground. Her heart was full of fear, but she took a deep breath. I can do this. And she quickly made her way across the flames. Before she knew it, she was standing on the other side. She looked down in amazement. Her feet hadn't burned. She breathed in relief until she saw the thicket of thorns in front of her. There was no path. It looked impossible to pass through. But she thought of that moment in the woods, imagining holding her very old child in her arms. She stepped in. This time she moved slowly, the thorns catching her at every step. First, they pulled off her cape, and then scratching her arms through her clothes, her cheeks, her chest, her legs were bleeding. But she could hear the river in the distance, and it got louder as she walked, and she just kept going. And when she felt like the pain was almost too much to bear, the sound of the river was practically deafening, and she stepped out, and she emerged. But this time there was no moment of relief, because the river in front of her, it was huge and moving so fast. But there was her house, just as the witch had said. She stepped forward. The water was freezing on her bare feet, but she just kept moving, holding on to the rocks until the water was reaching her waist and she saw there was nowhere to go but to swim. And so she took a deep breath and dove under the water. The current pulled her. She lost her breath from the cold, but she kept swimming until she could catch a rock and felt her feet on some solid ground. She stepped. She slowly made her way out of the river until finally, shivering and cold, she was there on the earth once again. And it was silent. River was gone. The thicket of thorns was gone. It was just the woods that she knew in her backyard. She did it. She began to run to her house, but she didn't see that there was a tree root sticking out from the ground, so she tripped and fell. She was so weak at this point. She almost laughed. Then she heard a rustling. She looked up, and not 15 feet away, there was a wolf. She stared at the wolf, and the wolf stared at her. She didn't dare move. Then something strange started to happen. Where only moments ago she was cold and wet, she started to feel warm. And her body started to glow a little, and she didn't understand. She remembered the words of the witch. The first gaze you see will grant your wish. No, she cried out. And the wolf ran up, and she ran home. She ran to the mirror and looked deep in her own eyes. Please, please. She still felt a little warm. Her body was still glowing. She told herself this was enough. And then her husband came in. He saw her wet and torn up and barefoot. Oh my God, are you okay? They hugged for a long time. And then she told him of everything that had occurred. Everything except her encounter with the wolf. She did lay with her husband that night, and indeed, 2 weeks later, her bleeding did not come. And before too long, her belly began to grow. She was so happy. This is what she had always wished for. She vowed to put the entire encounter with the witch far, far from her mind. As her belly began to grow and grow, it felt like the sun was shining brighter every day, and the flowers, the colors were more vivid. She and her husband would sing in their home. It was filled with the promise of new life. She decided to knit a baby blanket, and so she often would sit behind her home on sunny days and knit in the backyard. One day, she went inside to get a glass of water, and when she came out, the blanket was gone. It was so strange. It wasn't a windy day. She looked all over, but she couldn't find it. She decided to just start a new blanket. She didn't think too much of it. Well, a few days later, it was a warm evening. They left the back door open. So when she went to close it at night, she looked out and saw something a little strange, 2 white lights. She looked more closely. It was an animal. She quickly closed and locked the door. She touched her belly. Things started to get more strange after that. One day she was crossing the house and saw through the window a bright white sheet being torn off of the laundry line and an animal tearing off with it into the woods. Another day she opened her front door. There was a bloody rabbit sitting on her doorstep. She wasn't feeling okay after that. She kept the doors closed and locked all the time. She kept the windows drawn. She became more and more tense, and her husband asked her over and over what was wrong. She didn't dare tell him. One day, she was quickly hanging out the laundry to dry when she heard it. She heard a rustling sound, and there was the wolf. It was growling, and its teeth were bared. Its eyes were wild. It was looking straight at her. No, it was almost looking through her. No, please, no, she said as she began to back up, and the wolf lunged toward her. She jumped back, but it was almost as if the wolf didn't see her. It kept going, right in front of her, and she looked where the wolf was going. It was a huge black bear, foaming at the mouth, coming toward the woman. She backed up, but the wolf came in and knocked the bear to the ground. They tore at one another. There was blood everywhere until the bear limped away and the wolf ran off into the woods. Woman, she couldn't understand. The wolf saved my life. The wolf saved our lives. She walked to where the wolf had gone off into the woods, and she saw bloody footprints. So she followed them through the familiar woods and then deeper and deeper until the footprints stopped at what must have been the wolf's den. The woman hid behind a tree so she wouldn't be seen. She peered in, and then the wolf was there. She was licking her wounds, but she wasn't alone. Around her were 6 tiny pups. Some of them were playing and frolicking, but 2 of them were asleep atop a half-knit baby blanket, a bright white sheet, and what looked like a heavy woolen cape. And there was one in the corner who was gnawing on what looked like a bloody rabbit. She thought of the bloody rabbit on her doorstep and smiled. And then the wolf saw her. She held her breath and stepped back as the wolf slowly walked toward her and then sat down beside her. She took a deep breath and slowly put her hand on the wolf's head, and then the wolf leaned her head into the woman's belly. It was at this moment that the baby began to kick. three of them stayed together like that for a long time, until they could hear the cries and howls of the little wolf pups, and it was time for their mama to go back home. A few months later, a beautiful baby girl was born to the woman and her husband. She was born with quite a head of hair. It was thick, black and a little gray, almost like fur. And she was born with tiny teeth. And some say that when she cries, it sounds more like a howl. But nevertheless, they lived happily ever after. Thank you so much. So welcome Steve, who's also going to tell an original piece.
Today I'd like to tell an original story about a fisherman named Block and his beloved wife, Cupertina. And I'd like to think it has something important to say about the power of generosity toward the people we love the most. So, how Block foiled the devil. Our story begins with Block standing in front of the small shoreside cottage he shared with Cupertina, looking out to sea on a morning when the light seemed to make everything possible. But it was as if a shadow had been stalking Block. For the first time in all the time he had known Cupertina, he had lied to her that morning. He told Cupertina that instead of going out on the sea to fish, he was going to stay ashore for the day to mend his nets and work on his dory. None the wiser, Cupertina kissed him goodbye and went off to her workshop in the village, full of the smell of fresh cut wood, with the tools arrayed neatly behind the workbench and the smell of sea air coming in through the windows. And there was more to the shadow. For months, Block had feared a dark pain growing in his belly, and all his efforts to ignore it had failed. And so that morning, Block began to walk along the long arc of the beach away from the village. But he didn't walk along the beach for very long. He turned on a trail that led inland, past the dunes and the sawgrass, the scrubby growth just back from the shore, and into the deeper inland woods. The trail wound through pine-dark and boulder-strewn terrain. It intersected with other trails, and after a long walk, the trail ended in a clearing. And in the clearing was a house surrounded by a crooked little fence that could barely contain the explosion of plant life in the yard. Herbs and flowers, vines and trees and shrubs. Block saw plants growing in that yard that he had never seen anywhere else, even though he had spent his entire life in the area. He opened the crooked little gate and walked down the path to the cottage with the plants rubbing his sides as he went. Block took in, sighed out one last breath, and knocked on the door, which rattled in its frame. There was a long pause, and in fact, Block was about to turn around and go home. But he heard the scrape of a chair on a wooden floor and saw footsteps coming to the door. Everyone knew the woman who opened the door, the healer with her lean face and flyaway halo of white hair. Everyone in the village had visited the healer at some time in their life. And the healer took Block's hand and led him inside, and he looked up at the ceiling, covered with dried plants that created an aroma that Block had never smelled anywhere else. Block and the healer sat down in chairs facing each other next to her simple wooden table. And the healer began to knead at Block's hand. She kneaded deeply. And when she looked into Block's eyes, a shadow passed quickly across her face. And then with questions and with her hand, she continued to probe at Block's body. And it was only when she pressed on his belly Block winced in the spike of dark pain. The healer took Block's hands in hers again, and before she spoke a word, Block knew the verdict. He asked her, "How long do I have, and how will I ever tell Cupertine?" And the healer said, "Block, you are a good man, but even the best of us must pass away eventually. You have weeks, maybe months. Go home and tell Cupertina how much you love her, and do the best you can to be a good husband and make Cupertina happy. That is the best that you can do." Block nodded, and when he reached for the purse at his belt, the healer waved away any offer of payment. Block thanked her again, rose, and went back out into the changed day. And Block began to wind back along the trail to the shore. And he came around a particular bend in that trail, and Block did not need any explanation about who was waiting for him. The devil's long and agonized existence was carved into his face. He wore a long cloak, the color of soot with the smell of sulfur, and long, bony toes stuck out from underneath the cape, and his barbed tail snaked across the ground. For a long moment, Block and the devil stood and looked at each other silently. Block didn't want to say anything. He knew that the devil sets snares for the unwary. So it was the devil who broke the silence. "Fisherman, you have a problem that I can take away." Still wary, Block remained silent, and it again fell to the devil to break the silence. "One wish, fisherman. Use it wisely and your problem goes away." Block thought for a few long moments, and then he understood what he needed to ask. Block looked the devil in the eye, and he said, "I want an eternally happy life for my beloved wife, Cupertina." The devil had never felt passion or compassion, and so he completely misunderstood Block's wish. He laughed and said, "Fisherman, a happy life for a human, that is a trifle. Your wish is granted, but you know the price." And the devil reached out one clawed hand as if he was going to rip the heart straight from Block's chest. And Block looked the devil in the eye, and he said, "No." Well, in his long, tortured existence, the devil had rarely heard that word. "No." "No," said Block. "You promised me a happy life for Cupertina. And if I die in the forest today with no explanation and I do not return, Cupertina will be unhappy. But that's not what you promised." Well, even the devil has to honor a bargain. "Very well, fisherman. You may return home briefly with your wife. But you are mine." And with that, the devil with his cape swept up a puff of dirt into Block's eyes, and by the time he cleared his vision, the devil was gone. So Block wound his way home, and that night he kissed and hugged Cupertina. Even more than usual, he told her he loved her, and he did everything he could to hold her up and make her happy. And the next morning, Cupertina gave him a lingering kiss before she left for her workshop in the village. When Block went out to his dory, he knew exactly who was there waiting for him. "Fisherman, I gave you one last night of happiness with your life, but now you are mine. And the devil drew himself up to an unnatural height, and he looked down on Block. And Block looked up at the devil and said, no. There was something about Block, something in his eyes that made even the devil shrink back down. No. You promised me a happy life for Cupertino. And if I die today and do not live out all of our days together with Cupertino, she will not be happy. And that's not what you promised. The devil could only manage a growl from his throat, and he blew a puff of sand into Block's face, and again, when Block cleared his eyes, the devil was gone. Days turned into weeks and months and years, but time eventually will have its way with all of us. Block was not as broad as he used to be, and his hair was shot through with gray, and Cupertina's hands were not as strong as they had been when she was younger. She closed her shop for the last time, and Block pulled his dory in from the sea for the last time, and they settled down to enjoy their old age together. And so on a fall day, bright with the crisp promise of winter, Cupertina passed away. And the next day, the villagers laid her out in a beautiful coffin of wood that was a thank you for all the work and wood that she had done for them over the years. And all the villagers accompanied Block to the cemetery, and they laid Cupertina in her grave. Block, by now just a bit stooped, walked home alone after the funeral, and when he came around to the front of their house, he knew exactly who was standing there waiting for him. And it was something that passed for a smile over jagged and discolored teeth. The devil said, "Fisher man, I gave your wife her happy life. Now you are mine." And once again, the devil drew himself up to an unnatural height, and he reached out one clawed hand as if he were going to rip the heart straight out of Block's chest. But Block looked up at the devil and for one last time said, no. And the devil shrunk back down. Because once again, there was something about Block. There was something in the fisherman's eyes that made even the devil hesitate. And Block said, you promised me an eternally happy life for my beloved Cupertino. So if I die today and you drag me off to hell, even in heaven, Cupertino will look down and feel grief and be unhappy, and that is not what you promised. And for the first time in long, tortured centuries, the devil was simply speechless. He blew one last puff of sand into Block's eyes. For the final time, when Block cleared his vision, the devil was gone. Block did not live long after that. And so, on a bright winter day with sunlight streaming in, sitting in his favorite chair and looking out to sea, Block passed away. And now that is how he rejoined his beloved Cupertina in heaven. Thank you.